visiting 3 staff members, and most of them have reported feeling happier after each visit. Since 343 has been rather harmless thus far, all staff have been allowed access. According to SCP Tales, it was believed that 343 is the one who mentored SCP-239, allowing her to master her powers and create ways. SCP-239 is a small girl with the ability to do whatever she expresses a will to do, as long as she is conscious. If she can see it, she can change it. Hence, as a method of controlling 239, the Foundation has put her in a coma. However, SCP-239 later developed a complete resistance to the drugs the Foundation had used to keep her comatose. To stop her from reawakening, the director of SCP Foundation was forced to request the O5 Council for the immediate release of Dr. Alto Clef from his confinement, and immediately assigned him to this case. Dr. Clef was given access to any materials he required. All personnel were to assist Dr. Clef by any and all non-carnal means. Clef walked into the Victorian-styled study and smiled at the fragrance of pipe smoke and at the sight of old books. The old man was seated in a high-backed chair with a hardbound copy of Don Quixote open in his lap. The old man looked up, startled surprise, before smiling. Dr. Clef. Hello, 343. Oh, please. No numbers between friends. Sit, please. We both know what you are. I've never said anything about you. Not to anyone. Nor have I recommended your termination. Mainly because you stayed at level 3 and never posed a significant threat. You remember me from the GOC then? Geneva, 1989? And you remember that you owe me a favor. Yes, Doctor. I remember. I've come to collect. There's another type green. This one has progressed to level 4. I'm very old now, Doctor. I'm not sure how useful I can be. Sometimes I look for books, but I can't remember their names. They're just not there anymore. Just the other day, a young man came in here to ask me about something, and I forgot he was here. And then he wasn't. Just gone. And I can't remember him. No one wants to say anything. Your aid will be necessary. I am a man of honor, Doctor. I will do whatever you need. Days later, Dr. Clef appeared in SCP-239's containment. He was looking through the steel, attempting to get a glimpse at 239's sleeping form. He watched her, watched the fading phantasms of her flicker about the room and scratching at the walls. He turned and picked up the thin helmet, strapping it to his head. The body armor was a little bulkier than he'd anticipated, but it fit well enough. He pulled on the gloves, fingered the purple gun underneath his jacket, and felt through his pockets until he found the tiny box containing his emergency backup. He grinned and picked up a keycard, sliding it into a control panel in front of the glass. He flipped the switches all down to their off position and pulled out the revolver, bringing it up to point at 239, who was slowly waking up. Clef was running very quickly. He could feel her back there, floating somewhere. He risked a glance backward, watching the floors buckle into water and piss, dirt and air. He hoped she would be off balance enough from the medications that she would be less capable, less able to affect the environmental changes on the universe. He was quite sure it was a pointless hope now. He rounded the corner, and the walls slid into chunks of burning human flesh. The smell of human flesh began to turn his stomach slightly, before making it growl uncomfortably. One more turn, and he'd be at ground zero. Another 10 feet. 9, 8, 7. He burst through the doors. Where's 343? The doors opened slowly. The being that floated through them didn't look like it was, is, or had ever been a little girl. Years of atrophy had turned her limbs into spindly wires of flesh wrapped around bone. She wasn't able to lift them. She couldn't even turn her head. The tubes that had hung out of her arms were now crawling over her body like centipedes. She opened her mouth, trying to say something, but only a gurgle came out. She looked at Clef and gurgled again, louder, angrily. 343 was standing just behind 239, his face knit in concentration. The old man's nose had a drop of blood forming below the left nostril, slowly running down over the crest of his lip and dropping onto his shirt. The girl screamed in rage, and 343 cried out, staggered by the changes she was forcing into the world. The drugs in her system were quickly dissipating, with her control over the world around her returning. 239 turned the air into... and 343 cried out, staggered by the changes she was forcing into the world. The drugs in her system were quickly dissipating, with her control over the world around her returning. 239 turned the air into chlorine for a moment, just a moment before 343 could stop her. 343 was kneeling on the floor, ears bleeding. His knotted hands were clenched as his foe turned for the moment from Clef to float toward him. It was almost beautiful to watch, Clef thought, stopping for an instant to observe what he hoped was a rare circumstance. The distance between them crackled as the hovering female changed things, reversing the laws of physics and existence as 343 set them back into place. It was like watching a petulant child throw her toys to the floor while her patient grandfather picked them back up. Clef edged around near the door, raising the revolver again. He fired. Chunks of flesh were ripped from her body and thrown behind her to the mirror. She screamed as the cancer started to form almost instantly under her flesh. Don't care much for that, do you, little girl? Clef dropped the gun and tackled her before she could recover, hitting her tiny waist sharply and pushing her toward the mirror, grasping SCP-093 and shoving. They fell into a strange field, with rolling wheat and smells of emptiness. The girl was rolling on the ground, willing herself up off the ground pitifully. Clef stood nearby, knocking the bits of wheat and grass off his armor. He walked over and forced her body over. Sorry, dearie. Different world, different rules. Finally, he managed to knock her out. As she loses consciousness, her eyes thankfully glossed in the pleasant emptiness of oblivion. Remember to check out my new animation channel, The Rubber Talks, where I share my life story, thoughts, and opinions. Just click on the link in the description to enter the Rubber's world. Before we end this video,
Fuck off, Edge.
viewer discretion is advised. While the batteries were launched towards the repair drone, it was destroyed by a shell launched from SCP-2399. Command lost contact with Barrier Unit 45 15 seconds after the initial discharge. Hello everybody, I'm the Rubber. Today we bring you SCP Foundation Keter Class Object SCP-2399. SCP-2399, also known as a
different story. He looked into the cognito hazard testing screen, designed to cause psychic damage to anyone who hadn't been inoculated by the Foundation, and entered the large bunker. Automated guns lined the walls. He could see the outlines of trapdoors below him, and he was pretty sure the whole place was rigged to blow if a large-scale assault hit. The Foundation was taking no chance with whatever they had found in Egypt. What could they be keeping locked up below? As Dr. White walked through the long tunnel leading to the staircase, he could see a series of rules marked on the wall. No open flames allowed within SCP-4001. No firearms or bladed weapons allowed within SCP-4001. All writing utensils brought into SCP-4001 approved by a majority of the O5 Council. Violating these conditions, the case didn't show any books he was familiar with. None had standard titles. In fact, they all seemed to follow a simple format. Each title a different individual person. All books looked the exact same. Same binding, same thickness, same number of pages. Was this some sort of SCP reference library? Suddenly, a hand slapped down on Dr. Wright's shoulder and his heart nearly jumped out of his chest. He turned to see a gray-haired man in an SCP lab coat extending a hand to him. Dr. Waylon Henricks, Chief Scientist in charge of testing at SCP-4001. You must be Dr. Wright. He didn't give Dr. Wright a chance to respond. Dr. Henricks didn't seem like the kind of man to be very interested in what others had to say. Yes. About time the Foundation sent me a new research assistant. I suppose you have a lot of questions? Dr. Wright was supposed to be a researcher, not an assistant. He didn't suppose it would do any good to point that out. When Dr. Wright tried to question what it was that he'd be researching, Dr. Henricks told him that it would be easier to show than explain. With that, he motioned Dr. Wright to a nearby table, where one of the countless identical books on the shelves was waiting. He nodded at the book, prompting the younger doctor to turn it over and read the title. He couldn't believe what he saw. There on the front of the book was his name, Herman Wright. Dr. Wright looked at his colleague in confusion, and Dr. Henricks motioned for him to take a look. It was written in a language that he had never seen before, but was somehow instantly recognizable and understandable. And the book really was about him. Every detail of his life had been written down in this volume, starting with his birth, containing details that no one but he knew. His whole life story was here. From his childhood to his education to his eventual recruitment by the SCP Foundation. But the book wasn't completed. The last line that had been written described his entry into the secured confines of SCP-4001 that very day. Dr. Henricks had a mad glint in his eye. Are you starting to understand? One for each of us. Every person who has ever lived, roughly 120 billion people since the dawn of man. Their lives all written down in these books. Every time someone is born, their book appears in this library, and their story gets written as it happens. The Foundation has been monitoring this site since the 1800s, but it's been operating much longer than that, since the dawn of recorded history. Dr. Henricks passed Dr. Wright another book. It was simply titled The Hunter, and it chronicled the life of a prehistoric man who spent his days searching for wild game. He lived 23 violent, monotonous years before his story ended abruptly when a saber-toothed tiger decided it was interested in the same mammoth he was hunting. This must have been one of the oldest books in the library. A book for every person on Earth. Dr. Wright could only imagine what the scale of this massive library must be. Dr. Henricks explained that mapping the library was a huge challenge, before producing a map from his pocket and laying it out on the desk. You're at base camp. This is where new births generate on the shelves, along with books pertaining to the first humans. If you want to track down specific books, you'll need to know where you're going. We've established base camps around the library to mark significant eras in human history with notable books. At each camp, you'll find generators, supplies, and beacons to light your way. If you're going back far enough, you could be traveling for days or even weeks. Dr. Wright was fascinated by this bizarre location, containing the sum total of human experience within its massively expanding walls. But there was one thing he couldn't figure out. Just why was this seemingly harmless location, featuring constantly changing books, the most securely guarded SCP he had ever encountered? Dr. Henricks knew he was referring to the extensive rules he must have seen as he entered. The elder doctor reached into his pocket and said, "Let's just say that around here, the pen is mightier than the sword." He pressed the pen into Dr. Wright's hand and flipped open the back page of his book. It was blank. The rest of the story waiting to be written. What's something you've always wanted in your life, Dr. Wright? Think literally. Why not put it in your book or remove something you've always wanted gone? Slowly, Dr. Wright thought back to his teenage years and recalled an injury that he suffered in a mugging that damaged his leg and left him with a limp. He nervously used the pen to scribble out the words and sentences describing the event. After a few seconds, he felt a headache and suffered from a slight nosebleed. After that, the limp and pain from the injury was gone, and he could no longer recall the event. You see, Dr. Wright, that's the secret of SCP-4001, Dr. Henricks said with a mad gleam in his eye. This library doesn't just let us read the history of humanity. It lets us write it. That's why you're here, to test the limit of this power and see what this library can do for the Foundation. Dr. Henricks soon provided Dr. Wright with footage of some of the many tests conducted in the library, and what Dr. Wright saw amazed him. The books could rewrite the laws of nature with alarming speed, as some unfortunate D-Class personnel found out. D-0546 was was brought into a room with a full head of hair. The D-class personnel was instructed to scribble "lost all hair" into his book, and he soon started scratching his head as he rapidly started shedding hair. After less than 2 minutes, the man was completely calm.
Get your Woolies worth on back-to-school specials, like Carmen's protein bars 200-gram 5-pack, now $3.15 each. That's half price. That's why I pick Woolies.
T-0567, a young woman who had been brutally injured when attacked by an escaping SCP,
I'm
was
sorry,
bedridden and would
but
never walk again,
I
according
have
to all
to
the
take
Foundation
him.
doctors. As the T-class
Oh, good,
personnel
sorry,
used a pen to scribble
sorry,
over the
director.
line in her book describing her injury, Dr. Wright watched as she suffered a minor nosebleed, and then sat up, getting out of bed as if she had never been injured, and no longer remembered being attacked.
Are you ready?
Dr. Claire Williams,
Ready
a
for what,
Foundation
basically?
researcher sick with cancer, wrote into the book about curing her symptoms,
I wanna show you
and then
some
addressed
stuff.
the camera explaining that this was her third time altering her own book. Her lymphoma symptoms had
Basically.
returned after several months and 2 years, respectively, but it seemed that as long as she continued to make changes to her book,
I'm
then
gonna show you a secret SCP, basically, but no one knows about. Fair enough. Do I just go that way? Yeah, pretty much. Okay, follow me. Gotcha. It's this way. Be careful because this SCP is the most dangerous SCP here at this facility. It's dangerous on you and the Scarlet King, your father. I want you to go in there and try to make friends. Good luck. Okay. So, do you hate the human race? Yes, why? Why is that? Because I hate the human race too. Do you wanna join up together and destroy the human race? Why not? Cool. So, what's your name, by the way? My name is the Son of the Darkness Gods. Okay. Yeah, basically. Do you mind if I sit on your chair? Sure, go right ahead. Cool. So, how come they found you? Oh, back in the day, I was a researcher, and then I had sex with a SCP. They demoted me to a D-class, and then a couple of days later, I found out I was the son of the Scarlet King. You're the son of the Scarlet King, hey? Yeah, I am basically. Cool. Anyway, I have to get going, okay? All good. I'll swim by when I can. See ya. See ya for now. That's interesting. How did it go? He's not so bad. Trust me, he is towards us humans. But anyway, I have to go to my office, okay? Okay. See ya for now. See ya, site director. Jamie. she's gone. So let's head back to my crib, I guess. My place. My cell. My cell should be here. Let's press play. Smoke some weed, I guess.
Immediately disappeared. The indoor salesman then disappeared himself through the closet door before he could be apprehended again. At a loss for what to do, the agents administered Class A amnestics to Mrs. Yates's family and left. The reason for her disappearance wasn't fully known until 12 years later in 2015, when she reappeared in the same spot she disappeared from, having no concept of how much time had passed. The puppy really had just cost her 12 years of her life. Stories like that of Shirley Yates have popped up all over the state in the years since, from Everett to Walla Walla and everywhere in between. Due to the random nature of SCP-1879 events and the way the indoor salesman can disappear instantly in and out of any door in a building, the SCP Foundation has been unable to capture him. The best they've been able to do is monitor 911 calls from across the state, listening for keywords that might indicate another SCP-1879 infestation. When such an event is reported, the Foundation deploys Mobile Task Force Row 4, aka Shoe Salesman. This task force's entire purpose is to minimize the amount of harm the indoor salesman is able to cause by intercepting him before he can make a sale. This is a very important task, as evidenced by the story of Mrs. Yates, since while the products this salesman sells might be innocent, he doesn't accept payment in any normal currency. The price he asks for his products are always bizarre and often deadly. If all someone loses is 12 years of their life, they could be considered to be getting off easy. In one instance, the product being sold was a single red rose in exchange for the subject's heart. Once the deal was sealed, the subject dropped dead on the spot, with an autopsy revealing that his heart and circulatory system vanished from inside his body. In another, the indoor salesman offered 220 bananas and told the subject to simply give him some sugar. The subject agreed, and all candied goods in the home disappeared. In a third, the indoor salesman was trying to sell a thermonuclear warhead, the price of which was the subject's soul. The subject accepted, and at first nothing seemed to have happened. The Foundation confiscated the warhead and placed it into non-anomalous containment. Later that day, the subject went to listen to some music, only to find that two of her vinyl records had gone missing: Lady Soul and Almighty Fire by world-famous soul singer Aretha Franklin. So, even though he's incredibly invasive, annoying, and his transactions can be deadly, the indoor salesman still maintains a sense of humor. The fact that the Foundation can't capture the indoor salesman means that a lot of questions about him remain unanswered. The biggest by far is why he does what he does. In most SCP-1879 events, the indoor salesman seems frantic and desperate to make a sale. Often he will refer to having quotas and deadlines to meet, which implies some other unseen entity that he has to answer to. These questions remain unanswered because all attempts to interrogate the indoor salesman have been unsuccessful. When he manifests in a location, it's impossible to get him to stray from his sales pitch, and he disappears as soon as he successfully sells his wares. However, there was one instance where, after an SCP-1879 event took place, Foundation agents were there to witness a rare interaction between the indoor salesman and his mysterious employers. Agent Rogers and the rest of the shoes salesmen were called out to a home in Spokane, where rapid knocking had begun to emanate from the bedroom door. Equipped with recording devices, Rogers was able to record the voice of the indoor salesman coming from inside the bedroom. In the recording, the salesman grumbled to himself about not being able to meet his quota by tomorrow, saying that if he didn't, he'd be stuck in this world for the next century. He started knocking again, yelling through the door that he knew they were home. He kept knocking until he was interrupted by the sound of a phone ringing. The indoor salesman was heard picking it up. and Rogers managed to record the conversation. The person calling was, apparently, the indoor salesman's boss, who was calling to complain about his performance. Only one side of the conversation was heard, but evidently the indoor salesman's boss wasn't too happy about receiving 2 Aretha Franklin albums as payment instead of an actual human soul. The indoor salesman apologized for the joke, then told his boss, "It won't happen again. Please don't hurt it. I'll meet the quota this time, I swear." He hung up, grumbling to himself again, "I better get to move up to at least accounting this time. I've paid my dues and then some." Rogers finally opened the door to the apparent disappointment of the indoor salesman, who was hoping to speak with the home's owner, and was quite annoyed at having another one of his sales interrupted by MTF Row 4. Rogers tried to ask the indoor salesman who he'd just been speaking to on the phone, but as usual, the salesman started talking over him. "Now see here, let's think logically," he said. "You know I'm not going to tell you anything. I know you're not likely to buy what I'm selling. So let's just move on to greener pastures. I'm coming up close to a deadline, and I'm sure you're swamped with making sure good people don't lose their jobs, so I'll just be on my way and let you do that. Ciao." The indoor salesman tried to close the door, but Agent Rogers blocked it with his arm. He was tired of this SCP giving him the runaround, and he was going to keep the indoor salesman here if it was the last thing he did. He demanded the entity stay and be interviewed, and other members of the task force apprehended the salesman, making sure he couldn't leave the room. The indoor salesman, now held in place by several armed men, seemed to finally relent. He told Rogers, "I'm busy, so I'll tell you what. I'm going to give you something, no money out of your pocket, and we'll call it even. Sound good?" Rogers, just wanting to get this whole thing over with, agreed to those terms. 3 seconds later, every agent on the scene was dead, and the indoor salesman was able to straighten his tie, pick up his briefcase, and walk through the door to the bathroom. When the bodies of Agent Rogers and the rest of the MTF Row 4 were examined by Foundation scientists, the cause of death was found to be, in every case, thousands of coins suddenly appearing in not only their pockets, but also inside their stomachs, lungs, and even under their skin. Later that day, the salesman was reported at a home in the same neighborhood. He was seen trying to sell the house's owner, 80-year-old retiree Alan Johnson, a Glock 18 pistol in exchange for his attention. As he had done so many times before, the indoor salesman disappeared through another door before the Foundation was able to reach the scene. And when the SCP arrived, they found Mr. Johnson still alive, but now missing his brief frontal cortex, the part of the brain that controls attention. It's likely that, because of the nature of the entity, SCP-1879 might be entirely impossible to contain. The Foundation might never find out anything more than what they already know about the indoor salesman, the way he's able to manifest behind closed doors, or the reason he has to keep filling quotas for an unseen boss, who apparently doesn't have a very good sense of humor. So, if you're ever in Washington State, be careful who you open your doors to, especially if the knocking you hear is coming from inside your house. But now, if we could have just a few moments of your time, we've got something real special for you. It's SCP-001, which is the real 001. This is a 30-for-1 deal that you can't pass up, so go watch now. On the 13th of October, 1989, the town of Danner, Wisconsin was shaken by a seismic event unlike anything they'd ever experienced. This might have been written off as an earthquake, were it not for one disturbing factor. The ground-shaking event was accompanied by a huge spike of radioactivity, with the strange phenomenon happening a month before the Berlin Wall was torn down, during a period of the Cold War that historians call the Year of Crisis. It's easy to understand why the people of Danner immediately assumed the worst, but the huge eruption they felt wasn't the result of a nuclear bomb going off. The SCP Foundation was alerted to the event in Danner and picked up a series of radio transmissions coming from just outside the town. When they arrived, they found something incredible, like something out of a sci-fi movie. Standing at the quake's epicenter was a creature that looked to be from another world. Standing 2 meters tall and weighing almost 300 kilograms, the being was green and brown in color, with a bulky humanoid body. Its head was a different story, though, and resembled a gigantic housefly with a proboscis and huge stereoscopic eyes. Surprisingly, the strange creature did not immediately go on a rampage. Instead, the being, designated SCP-2273, appeared to be exhausted, injured, and extremely malnourished. It offered no resistance at all to the Foundation containment team, and it was taken to Site-17 without conflict. While the SCP Foundation is no stranger to visitors from other worlds, there was something especially unusual about this supposed alien invader. The doctors who examined the creature and treated its injuries found an appendage that seemed to function as an organic radio transmitter, and large open wounds on its shoulder blades and forearms where further appendages had been ripped off. Additionally, while its insect-like exoskeleton was mostly a uniform green and brown pattern, the creature's upper arms and torso were dotted with a variety of scars and markings that, on closer inspection, looked like military badges. Was this some kind of wounded intergalactic soldier who had been stranded on Earth? If it was, then how were the organic badges on this alien's exoskeleton a near-perfect match to military badges worn by soldiers in the Soviet Union? Even if they did reference a unit that didn't officially exist within the Soviet army, the scientists were sure this alien wasn't an alien at all. Underneath its exoskeleton was a non-anomalous human being. If that was true, then this was even more terrifying than an extraterrestrial visitor. The scientists were sure that the USSR had developed a new kind of organic armor, and this anomaly showing up in Wisconsin was the result of a test on US soil that had gone wrong. If that was the case, then there was no telling how many more of these exoskeletons were out there and would need to be contained. The Foundation had to act quickly and find out more. While SCP-2273 was recovering, they called in Dr. Friedrich, an on-site psychologist who could speak several languages including Russian. Dr. Friedrich would be tasked with interrogating the SCP on its origins and the nature of the suit. The interview being held by the American military. According to him, he had been in the middle of battle, and that the Americans had killed his men and left him for dead in the wilderness. Nothing that Dr. Friedrich told him, that there was no war, or that the Foundation was not affiliated with the US government, could convince him otherwise, and he refused to talk further. Before a second interview was conducted, Belitrov was given an old copy of the Level 1 Researcher General Debrief as a way of helping him further understand the nature of the Foundation and his containment. Belitrov was more cooperative after that, though the realization that he would most likely be kept in containment for the rest of his life caused him great distress, and he was unwilling to speak to Dr. Friedrich for another 3 days. Dr. Friedrich didn't give up though, and when Belitrov finally opened up to the doctor, he began to tell him more and more. Belitrov told the doctor that when he was a child, Russia was hit by an American nuclear warhead, and that the Soviet Union immediately retaliated. The resulting nuclear conflict, which Belitrov called the War to End the World, caused massive devastation and left most of the planet dangerously irradiated. That is why he had the exoskeleton. It was to shield him from the radiation and allow him to survive above ground. Unfortunately, Belitrov knew very little about how the suit was made or how it worked, saying that it was built by the engineers and that it grew naturally over a period of several years. But Belitrov hadn't made the decision himself. It was his parents who had volunteered him as a test subject for the exoskeleton suit program when he was still young, hoping it would give him a better chance at survival. The process of bonding the exoskeleton to the human body was extremely painful, but according to Belitrov, its advantages far outweighed the pain. The suit not only helped him survive in a nuclear wasteland, but made him a better soldier. The suit allowed him to lift and carry up to 1,200 kilograms, gave him stereoscopic vision, and the organic radio transmitter allowed him to communicate with other soldiers across long distances, as well as listen in on encrypted enemy transmissions. The wounds on his shoulders and arms, where it looked like appendages had been ripped out, were where his weapons and supply packs had previously been mounted. Belitrov had been stationed with his men in the area he was discovered when they were attacked by American soldiers. The soldiers had ripped off Belitrov's weapons and supply pack, and did the same to all his men as well. They were all shot, with Belitrov being spared for the moment only because the Americans had identified him as the commanding officer. Suddenly, there was a bright flash of light, and the American soldiers vanished. Not only that, but the landscape changed. Where there had been a post-nuclear wasteland before, now there were lush green trees. Injured and disoriented, Belitrov began sending distress signals, only to have those signals intercepted by the SCP Foundation. The most interesting part of Bellatrov's story, as far as the Foundation was concerned, came during his fourth interview, when Dr. Friedrich asked him about the engineers who had designed the exoskeleton suit. In Bellatrov's own words, they weren't truly known to man until the years of the Great War and the Revolution. The French found them in buried cities where the Western Allies were digging their trenches. Eventually, they were made to build weapons for the war by both sides. By his description, these engineers didn't sound human, but they were by no means unknown to the SCP Foundation. Bellatrov described the engineers as humanoid, nocturnal, covered in fur, and possessing technology and intelligence far beyond that of any human. Those familiar with the Foundation's history might already know the engineers by their Foundation designation of SCP-1000, or their more commonly known name, Bigfoot. A quick rundown. SCP-1000 are a species of intelligent humanoid primates that lived alongside humanity in highly advanced cities until their own technology was turned against them. Not only were their cities wiped off the face of the earth, but 70% of their population was slaughtered, and the survivors were driven mad to the point that their mental faculties were no higher than those of a chimpanzee.
Which I would join the guess.
The SCP Foundation is tasked with keeping them away from human contact, in fear of what the creatures would be able to do to humanity if they ever regained their memories and full mental function, and rumors have been spread about them possessing deadly anomalous properties. But evidently, the destruction of the SCP-1000 species never occurred in Bellatrov's universe, or if it did, it wasn't nearly as complete. In that timeline, humanity regained contact with SCP-1000 after discovering their underground cities sometime during World War I. After this discovery, both Allied and Axis powers began recruiting them to build weapons, and their weapons played a role in both the Russian Revolution and the Second World War. It was because of these technological advantages that the Cold War escalated into what would become the war to end all wars. Both sides were armed with not only nuclear warheads, but highly advanced, radiation-proof exoskeleton armor that allowed the conflict to continue even after the total destruction of the planet. While the humans fought above ground, life continued as normal for SCP-1000 in their underground cities. As Bellatrov noted, they never wore the armor themselves, as they had no need to venture above ground. Only soldiers wear armor, and this is not their war. Bellatrov continued to adjust to life in containment and sitting for regular interviews with Dr. Friedrich. He was given the rations provided for humanoid anomalies, but in much larger quantities, as the suit required him to eat around 8,000 calories a day to keep it functioning. Bellatrov also began taking advantage of his ability to access the Foundation's library. He would often read or listen to classical music, particularly by the Russian composer Tchaikovsky. He seemed especially fond of reading The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. No surprise, given he was able to directly relate to the experience of living through an apocalypse and being transported to a strange timeline with no way to return home. But with little else to occupy his time, Bellatrov began to display symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder, reporting in his now regular interviews with Dr. Friedrich that he was constantly reliving memories of the battles he'd fought and the lives he had taken in combat. The suit was making the problems worse too, it seemed. It was as if he could never forget, as one of its features was an ability to store and replay memories. This feature was intended as a strategic aid that would allow commanding officers to more effectively gather and process information about their surroundings. But outside of combat, this only served to force Bellatrov into reliving his most painful memories again and again. Every night as he tried to sleep, he would see the faces of his men, their weapons torn from their exoskeletons, laying in the dirt after being gunned down by the enemy. Like many veterans, Bellatrov was being hit all at once with the harsh realities of war. Now that his brain wasn't solely focused on keeping him alive, it had time to process all the horrors he'd experienced. He told Dr. Friedrich, "I trained alongside these men for years before they put us back on the surface. Since we were all young children, we were brothers, and I gave them the order to surrender and got them killed. I should have died with them." While the story of SCP-2273 ends here, the story of Alexei Bellatrov, SCP-2273-1 continues. In 2018, Bellatrov was allowed passage to Volgograd, Russia, as part of an anomaly reintegration program. While he was unable to secure employment within the Russian government as he had hoped, he eventually was taken in by a monastery and continued to write letters to Dr. Friedrich until Friedrich's eventual death from lymphoma-related complications. There's plenty more on the monastery, the anomaly reintegration program, and what happened to Major Belatrov when he returned to Russia, but that will have to be a story for another day. But if you're hungry for more SCP content right now, go check out our series on SCP-5000 The Suit, or the two-part saga of what happened at Site-13. Goodbye for now, my friends.
Last year, I was hired to drive a pair of pugs from Broome. A young man is in the middle of one of his regular night jogs through the park. He loves running through this park at night. It's dark, the air is cool, and the sounds of the city that surround the park disappear, offering peace, quiet, and a small reprieve from the busy world. He jogs along a path that winds through the park and starts upon a section that is surrounded on both sides by tall trees. He follows the path around a sharp bend and is stopped in his tracks. Standing there, in the middle of the track, is a figure. It has its back to him and isn't moving. He's tall and so uniformly black that he almost disappears into the night. Whoever or whatever this is, he's scared of it. But the creature doesn't move, and neither does he. He's frozen, unsure of what to do, when the creature suddenly turns his head towards him, revealing a pair of bright, glowing eyes. The runner is so terrified he can't even scream. He falls and crawls backwards in the dirt, trying to get away from the creature. The creature turns its body towards him and begins stepping forward. The runner scrambles to his feet and runs. He's sprinting as hard and as fast as he can, adrenaline pumping, heart pounding, trying to put as much distance as he can between himself and that thing. His muscles burn, his lungs